You are listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm Tom, and today we are going to explore the world of mainstream cinema, delving into our thoughts on the topic and exploring the merits and the negative attributes of films that fall into this category. For those that have been listening since the very first episode, you may remember that Gary introduced the phrase mainstream trash when we were talking about our film journeys. However, there is much more to mainstream cinema than this aspect, and we're excited to explore an area of cinema that we've only briefly touched upon in our podcast so far. I am joined today with my brilliant co-hosts, Sol and Matthieu, who is joining us for the very first time. So if you'd like to introduce yourself, Matthieu.
Yeah, thank you. Hi. So I'm Matthieu, or Teproc on the ICM forum. I'm French, like Clem, the second Frenchman on the podcast. I guess I'm filling in for him. I'm a much more recent cinephile than most of you guys. I've only really gotten into film around 2015, I would say. So very recent, and I guess I'm much less experienced than many of you. But I am passionate also, so I'm very excited to participate in this.
That's great. We're happy to have you here. And over to you, Sol.
I'm Sol from Australia. I'm 33 years old. I've been into cinema for 19 years.
So it's great to have everyone on board. We'll start out with a little round table just to discuss our views on mainstream cinema and perhaps explore the angle that not all mainstream cinema is trash. So I'm looking forward to seeing what examples people may have of high quality, famous films that fall within the mainstream. So Matthieu, if you're happy to start, that'd be great.
So I guess I don't particularly think that mainstream cinema is trash. I guess there is a lot of trash in mainstream cinema, but I guess there is a lot of trash in cinema in general. But it is true that mainstream cinema, because it is so pervasive and unavoidable, when there is trash, it's harder to avoid. So obviously we get more obsessed with that and with the idea of differentiating ourselves from that. That being said, yeah, there's plenty of mainstream cinema I love. And I think there's a bit of a question about what mainstream cinema really is. Is it just blockbusters or is it a larger thing than that? There's also mainstream comedies. One example, I guess, for me would be something like The Blues Brothers is a very mainstream comedy, which I love. I guess I grew up with it. And I think that's also an important part of what kind of links us with mainstream cinema, is that often it's the stuff we grew up with, right? Because obviously when you're like 10 years old, you're not going to be watching Bergman or Bresson, like you're not going to be watching very difficult film to access. You're going to be watching mainstream cinema. So in a sense, it's what we all started with to various extents. I guess for action films, an example of mainstream cinema that I really love is The Matrix. And I think The Matrix is an interesting example in that the fact that it is mainstream is kind of the point, because it has this very universal message. And I think the way in which it addresses the world at large is, the fact that it is mainstream cinema is really important to it. It's an intricate part of what the film is. And I think that's an aspect that we can't really overlook, as opposed to art house cinema, which is great also, but has different qualities.
I thought it was a very interesting topic, mainstream cinema, because I'm not sure myself what mainstream cinema means. I define that by films that are just playing in regular cinemas, or as opposed to films that are playing in art house cinemas. My tastes have changed quite a bit over time. It was just interesting to hear some of my co-host comments. Like Matthieu talked about mainstream cinema being the stuff that we grew up with. And he was saying that at 10 years old, nobody's really watching experimental films. I actually started watching films like Un Chien Andalou from Louis Buñuel and films like the original Nosferatu very early on into my cinema going journey. So I wanted to see where films had progressed from. But it's just interesting in terms of considering what actually mainstream cinema is like.
It's great to hear from Sol and Matthieu and their experiences with mainstream cinema and how it has a great impact in shaping our viewing habits from a younger age. If you think about it, when you're first getting into cinema, a lot of your idols will be people like James Bond, Indiana Jones, Luke Skywalker, because they're what you're exposed to at a young age, and it acts as a gateway into cinema. And this is in a way very similar to younger audiences now digesting the Marvel film and idolizing the superheroes that are gracing the big screen so often these days.
Yeah, I guess one aspect we can go into, if we're talking about idols and the way it is now, is the comparison that is often made between superhero movies now and westerns in like the 50s. I mean, I think that comparison has some issues, but in a sense, it is kind of this mainstream genre, the main successful genre, and there are some variations on it that we are seeing that can be more or less interesting. And yeah, the way in which it impacts younger people, I think, is relevant. I think in 20 years, we'll see that maybe some films that we don't necessarily think of as being that important will become part of the canon. I guess that's another aspect of mainstream cinema. It is ever changing. What is mainstream cinema now might not be that way tomorrow. And similarly, I mean, silent films in general, now it's not mainstream to watch them. But obviously, in the 20s, I mean, that was mainstream cinema. I don't know about Nosferatu, but, like The Big Parade, right? Now that's not mainstream, but at the time it was. Or even from a country to another, like Ghibli. And Ghibli is definitely mainstream in Japan. I mean, Spirited Away is like the most successful or one of the most successful films of all time. But in the US or in Europe, Ghibli is more of a cinephile thing.
I think that's a very good point from Matthieu. And it's one of the reasons why I've had a real hard time getting my head around this concept of mainstream cinema. I think mainstream cinema only exists in the mind because it does change. And not just over time, it's with things like the awards. Films like The Artist and even Parasite, I think, are now mainstream films because they've won the Best Picture Oscar. They've started being showing in cinemas everywhere. You can buy them, or you can buy The Artist at least on DVD everywhere, so it's widely known. So that's changed just overnight or just over a period of months, suddenly become mainstream. I think also about the Studio Ghibli films, I think it's another really good example of something which might not be mainstream over here, but would be mainstream over there. And I guess with a lot of the Australian films that I see in cinemas or that I see on DVD over here, would things where people would find quite exotic if it was shown overseas, whereas it's just an everyday film to me over here.
That's an interesting point that you make about Parasite, Sol. I love that, obviously, a film that unexpectedly enters into the mainstream because of the awards recognition that it receives and allows it to reach a wider audience. And it's great when international films do that because it expands the horizons of moviegoers who perhaps wouldn't usually take a punt on a South Korean film.
Regarding awards, there's also the peculiar category of biopics and what we call awards bait, those films that are made for awards, which are not necessarily that commercially successful. I mean, maybe they do fine, but they are very much mainstream. And often, generally, these movies and generally feel-good movies, they tend to come up a lot when you talk with people who are not particularly cinephiles, who just watch some movies. And generally, these movies tend to be pretty popular with the mainstream audience also, even if they're not as big as, the big blockbusters.
That's a great point, Matthieu, because I, for one, have watched a lot of biopics. It's one of my girlfriend's favourite go-to genres, so we see most of the big mainstream releases that cover this territory. Now, even if the film quality isn't particularly great from kind of an artistic point of sensibility, you will always enjoy them if the story behind it is fascinating because you learn something new from it. Whereas my view is that regardless of whether the background story is fascinating, if it isn't presented in an interesting way that captivates me, then I'm usually kind of disappointed in that regard. So I'd be curious to hear what your thoughts were on the biopic genre.
I think with biopics, a lot of it depends on the person and how well they're known and how much they're still a part of popular culture. I'm thinking of something like Bohemian Rhapsody or even Rocket Man would definitely be ones that I'd consider to be mainstream films because they're about artists, musicians, singers whose work is still played time and time again. So people know who they are, know about the stories. Something different like Jefferson in Paris, which is a Merchant Ivory film from the 90s, might not be so mainstream because outside of people in America, people might not be so sure who Thomas Jefferson is.
Yeah, yes, that's a good point. That some genres like biopics or superhero movies now, Western at a certain time, are considered generally mainstream, but not all films in that genre are that mainstream. I mean, you have artists experimenting with the genres and giving you something that is very much outside the mainstream. I guess parallel but different from genre considerations, the issue of what is mainstream.
So if we think about the idea of mainstream and how it doesn't always mean bad films, I'd like to point out a shining example of this in the work of Christopher Nolan, who obviously started out with his independent films Following and Memento, before becoming a household name when tackling the Dark Knight trilogy and becoming a very successful director who has great critical and commercial success. He seems to combine a grand sense of storytelling with intelligent concepts to deliver fascinating feature films with mainstream appeal that also showcase an incredible awareness of the medium's artistic qualities. I would take Interstellar and Inception as two perfect examples of this, and you can't imagine many other directors working today being allowed such freedom when creating films requiring an enormous financial backing to bring their inventive vision to life. So I'm curious as to what examples you may have of mainstream films that have, blown you away, that have been particularly impressive.
As mentioned before, I'm not sure if the term mainstream really exists, whether there really is such thing as mainstream cinema. What I can talk about, though, is that there are some films that obviously have much bigger budgets than others. And with something like Interstellar, I actually did really love that. And obviously, if Christopher Nolan didn't have such big success with the Batman films, he probably wouldn't have had the budget at his disposal to be able to make something as breathtaking as Interstellar is. So I guess from that point of view, that's quite an achievement. But in terms of mainstream cinema, what mainstream is, I just think it really exists much in our mind. It varies from country to country, and it changes a lot with awards and other things that bring films into consideration. So I could talk about specific films, but actually talking about mainstream as a concept is something that I find really hard to still get my head around.
I guess if you want another example of a mainstream film I love, one would be Pulp Fiction. I guess is in case in that it is in a sense an independent film. I think in the way it produced, I'm pretty sure. And it was at Cannes, which is not exactly the temple of the mainstream, but it ended up being very much a mainstream movie and something that everyone knows. And that's my favorite movie in the way which plays also with these mainstream tropes, right? It takes all these elements of 70s films in particular, but really also from more auteurist stuff like Godard. And I think Pulp Fiction, really what I love about it is the way in which it is playful like that, which is something that I think the best of mainstream cinema can be.
It's an interesting point about Pulp Fiction, whether it is really a mainstream film, if it was made as an independent film, and if it's only after it won the Palme d'Or that it got all this extra recognition and then became an awards success and everything. So I feel that's the same way with a lot of other films like Parasite. If it hadn't won the Palme d'Or, if it hadn't gone on the awards trail path, would we be talking about it as a mainstream cinema film? Of course, not everything that wins the Palme d'Or at Cannes necessarily goes on to be a mainstream film. I'm thinking of things like Winter Sleep, that's still very on the side that if you told somebody about that film and it's a regular person on the street, they wouldn't have heard of it. But a lot of other films, obviously like Taxi Driver, that have won the Palme d'Or over time, might have started off as a small, maybe more independent film, but has come on to have a much bigger reputation since then, and has actually become an ingrained part of cinema culture, the same way that Pulp Fiction is.
Pulp Fiction is a great example. It tapped into something of popular culture around the time that just proved to make it so successful. And that's an interesting thing to consider with mainstream cinema. Some films get to be that way because of the marketing side of it, the big push by studios to make them a mainstream success. But there are some films that just through the quality of the filmmaking, the word of mouth, eventually make it into the mainstream.
Which is an interesting point, Tom, bringing it back to Christopher Nolan and a film like Memento. It's purely through word of mouth that Memento became such a big success. It started off as a very small or small budget type of film, and it's for everybody talking about it in different structure and how it was so different and how it was so interesting that it actually became part of the mainstream. Otherwise, much like Following, Chris Nolan's film from 1998, which otherwise might seem a little bit out of the usual.
As a huge horror fan, That's a quote that I seem to fit into most episodes, but given the chance, I can't help but speak about horror. I'm obviously interested in when horror transcends into the mainstream, and it seems to be doing this recently with a lot of success with quite a bit of intelligent horror coming through. A recent film that was in the mainstream that I really enjoyed was The Invisible Man. I thought this was a brilliant reimagining of the original source novel. So I suppose in this one, toxic masculinity and abusive relationships are introduced to H.G. Wells' classic story about invisibility, and this updates the science fiction thriller for contemporary audiences in a vicious reimagining of the source material. Gone are the toxins and chemicals used by the villain to become undetectable by the eye in Wells's novel. And in place of these is a technologically advanced suit that bestows its wearer with invisibility. And after this, you cue umpteen scenes where the camera pans around empty rooms that surprisingly never become easy to stomach, as the constant threat of an unseen presence is exploited to its maximum potential. And I think this is a great example of a mainstream film that appeals to mass audiences, but there's also a lot of intelligence in the writing and the presentation of the film that allows people with perhaps a finer appreciation of the artistic side of cinema to get an enjoyment out of the film as well.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think The Invisible Man is a great example of that. And also it goes into the idea of entertainment, right? It is a very entertaining film while it still tackles those issues. And I guess that's maybe the best of mainstream cinema can do, is be extremely entertaining while still having underlying issues that is interested in.
I haven't actually seen The Invisible Man. It's one that I was very curious about. The Invisible Man was a film that I was interested in, which I wanted to see, but then coronavirus hit and the cinemas closed, so I never got around to it. I do really like the James Whale film from 1933, and I'm curious to see how it's updated for modern times. Interesting question though. Lee Winnell, the director behind it, made a really cool film called Upgrade a couple of years ago. And the question will be, well, would Upgrade now be considered a mainstream film? It was a bit like Artie when it came out over here. Is it considered mainstream now because people are looking at more of his films after the success of The Invisible Man?
I would tend to say no on that, just because I don't think it's that well known yet. But maybe, I mean, that's a debatable point. I mean, I guess it's also another concept we haven't talked about, exploitation or pulp or, this kind of film that is in some ways mainstream because they are made for big audience, right, in theaters. But in another sense, because they are not very respected, as opposed to even blockbusters, which are respected at least by the industry, I guess that's another kind of gray area. I would put Upgrade outside the mainstream, but it's a debatable point.
I just might mention with Upgrade, it's interesting because it is an Australian film, or at least partially financed in Australia. So it was definitely a very mainstream film over here. It was actually showing in cinemas all across Perth, so I could see it without having to drive all the way to an art house cinema. But it's something where I've talked to people overseas, and the people who've seen it overseas had said all that to go to an art house cinema to see it. They couldn't see it at the regular cinemas. So it just shows, I guess, that cultural barrier. And what's mainstream over here might not be quite so mainstream across the world.
That's an interesting point, Sol, and it bridges back to the notion of mainstream cinema being different for different countries, depending on what is popular over there at any given time. I wouldn't class Upgrade as a mainstream film personally, but I think that you raise an interesting point about whether when a director reaches a certain level of success, their past films would then potentially have the opportunity to be considered mainstream by virtue of the director almost becoming a household name. I think that's an interesting area, whether a film could be considered retrospectively mainstream or whether it should only be considered mainstream if it is popular and successful at the time of its release.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. And you can go back to people like Steven Spielberg, films like Jewel, which was a TV movie, and The Sugarland Express with Goldie Hawn, which is a fantastic film. And I don't think any of those are really big films, but since the success of Jaws and Close Encounters and all the films in the 80s, Spielberg's such a household name that I think those two films, Jewel and Sugarland Express, are actually quite well known these days.
And to take the opposite point, I think, a bunch of silent movies are an example, but also like some of the big 60s epics, like even Cleopatra. Cleopatra is pretty well known, I guess, because it was so expensive and stuff, but it was a big deal at the time just because it was very famous. But I think most people don't necessarily know about it now. In the other way around, right? Stuff that was mainstream at some point and isn't really now.
Yeah, it's a very good point about Cleopatra, and it's one of the big films of 1963. And you go to the 1963 Oscars, and the film Tom Jones won Best Picture. You mentioned Tom Jones these days, people think, oh, the singer. Nobody actually knows that British film that won the Best Picture Oscar. The big films from 1963 are stuff like The Great Escape or and a Half. If you're into cinema, you might know that the Fellini film. Things like Tom Jones might have been big back then, but they're not actually big these days.
So, as a counterpoint to the mainstream films we like and appreciate, I thought it would be interesting to perhaps put forward some examples of mainstream films that haven't made such a positive impression on us. I've got quite a recent example in the Harley Quinn superhero film Birds of Prey. And in this, a dazzling kaleidoscope of colours and comic book violence awaits anyone who enters her world. Basically, Quinn narrates her own lurid tale involving a stolen diamond and a prize ransom as she smashes her way through Gotham City, maniacally destroying everything in her path and often making it through unscathed thanks to sheer luck. Apart from one slick fight scene in a circus that bursts with frenetic energy, these sequences are mostly forgettable, offering light entertainment but bringing nothing new to the oversaturated world of comic book adaptations. If you are someone who's after popcorn fodder or mindless entertainment, you could probably do far worse. But when another villain of Gotham City has recently graced the big screen with such an unforgettable impact, it's hard not to view Birds of Prey as a missed opportunity. And it strikes me that it's a film that people who don't visit the cinema that often will perhaps enjoy more than others because, it's loud, it's bright, it's in your face, it's noisy, and it's easy to get lost in it. When you really take a look at the quality of the film and how it's been produced, there's a lot of areas in which it's lacking.
So my example of a mainstream film I don't like is actually a specific French example. You may not even know it, I guess, but it is very famous in France, and that is Taxi, which is a film not by Luc Besson. The director is actually Gérard Pires, but it was written by Luc Besson and produced, and it was a very influential film. I think I picked it because it's very representative to me of of the whole Besson thing, right? Because that's definitely a part of French cinema that is trying to emulate Hollywood, because there is a lot of mainstream cinema that's just comedies, but there's not a lot of action and Hollywood type films. And so Besson is trying to do that. And I think Taxi is a very good example of the ways in which he takes everything that's wrong with Hollywood blockbusters without much of the good, because there's a lot of, in the way the women characters are written, or are they written at all, really? You have Marion Cotillard in that film, and she's playing nothing. You have a main character who's supposed to be charismatic, but I guess there's something there, but the way the character is written is extremely flat. And even the action scenes, there are some other Besson films like The Transporter that do a little better with that. But Taxi is supposed to have these exciting chase scenes, and they're very flat, they don't really work. I think it's, in a sense, an ambitious film, and I guess you could respect it for that, but it is so backwards looking in both its views on women and also on foreign people, specifically people from Asia in that film. And I guess I picked it because it's in a way a disappointment. It's the kind I would like France and other countries to be able to make that kind of movie, because why not? After all, it's interesting that China is doing them, for example. But it's interesting to have a film like in Marseille, because often Paris is the big thing for action in France. But yeah, it's very disappointing to me, and it's a film that really represents the misogyny, especially, that is very present in that line of films, and that I kind of hate that it has become a representative, at least in Europe and I think also elsewhere, of kind of action French cinema.
Although I haven't seen Taxi, your description of it just reminds me of countless other commercial films that seem to be made first and foremost with the idea of making money. So you get all these big franchises, unnecessary sequels and spin-offs that are churned out solely with the purpose of making money, and where the talent of the filmmakers or actors isn't perhaps put into best use. I see that there've been a number of sequels to Taxi, and it kind of reminds me of the same thing that's happened with the Fast and Furious sequels, although they are to varying degrees of quality. But it does at times feel like films from Hollywood and the big studios follow a set template, and they rarely take risks, and they don't like to innovate or try different things, because when they do step outside of the comfort zone, there is a chance that the films that are made could potentially end up losing their money. And I think that's a sad state of the industry, but it is something that exists.
Yeah, and I guess I should point out that Taxi does have 4 sequels. So, yeah, this is not a unique problem to Hollywood.
I thought it was interesting that a lot of people are doing examples of sequels and remakes and franchises. If I'm talking about a mainstream film that didn't really do much for me, I might go with the recent Halloween from 2018, which doesn't actually add anything extra to the story. It was really hyped up. It's going to be this big confrontation between the Laurie Strode character and Michael Myers. Very little of the film is actually dedicated to it. Much of it's a very standard psycho killer type of film, which I guess is good for drawing in crowds and getting in the money. But if I actually look at the Halloween franchise in general, most of the sequels aren't very good, or at least not compared to Nightmare on Elm Street, which has actually got some decent sequels in there. But a really good Halloween sequel, or decent for the franchise at least, was Halloween Resurrection, which actually tried to do something different with the concept, a bit of like virtual reality, going into the house, which is actually a little bit different. Whereas the more recent Halloween was just another slasher film.
And I suppose with horrors being so cheap to make, usually that's why we see a lot of remakes and sequels, because studios don't have to invest a lot of money for a big return, because a lot of mainstream audiences will go and see a horror regardless of its quality. They tend to be a good film for first dates and things like that, and groups of friends who just want to laugh. So I think horror always tends to do quite well in the main, regardless of the quality.
Yeah, I get that with horror films, that they are very good for the mainstream. I guess a lot of people are going into them because they want to be scared or shocked or frightened or see something unexpected. And with a lot of the more recent ones, they sort of play on people having not seen the older films, going something like, oh, Nightmare on Elm Street's from 1984, yawn, I don't want to see that. I'm going to see this new version with Rooney Mara in it instead. So they're recycling the same ideas, they're trying to update them for different generations. And there's lots of recycling which goes along, and there are some good horror films out there, but a lot of it's just playing to what people want, a scary image here and there, a jump here and there, a boo moment here and there, but it's actually not the sort of intellectual horror films that we saw like really shine, I guess, in the 1980s, when people like David Cronenberg and Wes Craven were really flourishing and bringing a whole lot of new ideas to the screen.
So something that both of your examples make me think of is that I haven't seen them, but what I've heard is that the new Halloween remake has a whole thing about a podcast, and that Birds of Prey is a would-be feminist movie, and whether or not it is a whole discussion. And I think that's kind of an element of mainstream films that don't work, is that they try to be of the moment, but it seems artificial and fake and opportunistic, as opposed to what we talked about earlier with Pulp Fiction, is that it is of the moment just because it is. Maybe it tried to be of the moment, whatever the case may be, it succeeded. So I think that's kind of the type of mainstream films that fail, is they try to be of the moment, but it comes off as artificial.
Yeah, the new Halloween film is definitely not a pro-feminist film. Stuff with Laurie Strode fighting with Michael Myers is contained to a very small section of the film. And if you want to see a better version of Halloween, I'd actually go to the Rob Zombie film, which I got bashed a lot when it came out. But it's actually a really good film that actually explores Michael's backstory and presents him as more of a character rather than just a monster. I actually have to admit I prefer it to the John Carpenter original, although of course nothing can replace John Carpenter's original music score. That's a complete classic.
I must say that your comments about Birds of Prey and about the feminist stance and how artificial it feels were spot on the money, which is quite impressive considering you haven't seen it yet.
Well, that's what listening to podcasts does for you. I know a bunch about films I haven't seen. It's maybe not the most useful piece of information.
Another good example would be the fourth Mad Max film, Fury Road. That was really talked about as being really pro-feminist, has got this new feminist angle in there. It's going to be so great, better than the first two films. And I sat down and watched it, and the first three Mad Max films didn't really do much for me. I did sort of prefer the fourth film out of the four films, but not by a huge amount. I wouldn't really say having that Charlize Theron character in there really pushed it much in the feminist way that people were talking about when they were raving about it online.
I would disagree on that film in particular. I do really like Fury Road, and I mean whether or not it's feminist, it's certainly not for me to say. But I do think there is more than just having the Furiosa character, played by Charlize Theron. I think it's not just that. It's also the whole way that the world is set up, right? The whole structure of the Immortan Joe thing with the women he's exploiting for milk and stuff. I mean, I think there is a lot more there that is substantial, and I do really like that movie. As far as I'm concerned, at least it does.
Yeah, that's right. Look, as I said before, I probably liked Fury Road the most out of the Mad Max films. Nothing really did much for me, and I guess it wasn't maybe feminist in the way that I was led to believe, but it's probably had more of a pro-feminist drive than the original films did from 1979 and the two from the 1980s.
I really love Fury Road. I think it's a brilliant film, and it's a great example of another mainstream film that it can be enjoyed just face value for what it is. Or as you mentioned, the feminist stance, the other things in the subtext can be appreciated as well. So it works on both levels, and I think that films that offer that, the kind of on the surface, the immersion for audiences who just want to escape, and then the subtext for people who want to analyze their films and get a bit more out of it. Films that can combine those two elements do particularly well in them. And that kind of links us into our next topic, where we were going to talk about challenging or unique films that have broken into the mainstream. So for me, I think that horror, again, is great at doing this. So I spoke earlier about The Invisible Man, but there are many other young, talented directors, Jordan Peele, who worked on Get Out and Us, that did particularly well in the mainstream, and Ari Aster with Hereditary and Midsommar, maybe made less of an impact as the previous films, but they still found a way to tap into modern audiences' fears. And all of these films are horrifying films that contain thought-provoking subtext, which acts as a powerful foundation to the original offerings of the storylines. So these films, again, can be taken at face value for the frightening horror films they are, but they also provide intelligent audiences with the chance to delve further into the deeper social and political messages that the directors are striving for.
I thought I might just mention on that, Hereditary and Midsommar were not mainstream films in Australia. Not sure about Hereditary because I saw that on DVD, but it wasn't showing in a lot of cinemas. And when I went to see Midsommar, I think there were only two cinemas in the whole of my city that were actually playing it. So I didn't quite call those mainstream, but I guess over in the UK they might be mainstream. Down here, they're sort of more left of field, so to speak, if maybe not quite house-ish. In terms of Jordan Peele, Get Out was an excellent film, and I really enjoyed that. That was really thought-provoking and really funny also at times. Us was interesting, but I thought as it went along, I thought it fell apart because there were a lot of things with its mythology which weren't properly explained or left a lot more questions than answers. At the end of it, it actually felt very generic to me, even though what Peele was trying to do, and I could see he was trying to do something a little bit different with his mythology. I just thought it came out a little bit jumbled for me, and I just felt just like most other horror films by the end, unfortunately. I did love Get Out. I thought that was really innovative.
I guess a little horror adjacent. To me, the most obvious example of a film that really was successful despite not being very strange and weird and not being a mainstream film is 2001. I guess there's only one section of 2001 that you could qualify as mainstream, which is the third section, which is a bit of a thriller. But even then, it's a pretty slow one. And somehow it was a pretty big box office hit with people going to midnight screenings, and it kind of started a whole movement. And I think that's kind of a fascinating example of a film that wasn't supposed to be mainstream in a sense, and ended up being. And yeah, the ways in which mainstream can be unpredictable.
As I mentioned earlier on, I think the awards have a lot to do with how different films that are a bit challenging break into the mainstream. I already mentioned The Artist, which before it won the Best Director at Cannes wasn't really picked up. It wasn't made for the mainstream market. And something like Parasite, which again it was definitely not made for mainstream crowds, but has become much a household name now. Even some other things recently, like Moonlight, wasn't much of a mainstream film. That's one that was only showing in a couple of cinemas. I didn't actually see it myself in cinemas, but when I saw Moonlight on Blu-ray, I was actually really blown away by it. So in terms of challenging, yeah, it's interesting. You could even go to things like Terrence Malick. Are you going to say something like The Tree of Life is mainstream? I don't know if I actually would, because that's an anti-narrative film, even though I got a Best Picture and Best Director nomination. But I think a lot of the award ceremonies, especially when films win very big awards, I think they sort of propel them up a little bit further and give them a bit more recognition and become a bit more of a film where somebody goes, "Oh, have you seen that film?" And they go, "Oh, no, I haven't." And then actually maybe go out and finally see it. Another good example, I think, is The Favourite, which was only showing, I think, in a couple of cinemas when it first came out here. However, after Olivia Colman won the Oscar for it, people were going, "Well, have you seen this film? Won the Best Actress Oscar." And that's actually a very challenging film. It's very different. The fisheye photography there is very unusual, and it's a superb film, but it's one that wasn't quite in the mainstream, I don't think, until they had that Academy Award success.
The Favourite is a great example, and again, it kind of reiterates the importance of the awards because they raise attention to films that might not necessarily have mass appeal, but when they have the right promotion behind them or get the right word of mouth, they reach wider audiences and inevitably make an impact. And it's great to see films such as The Favourite or Moonlight, or again 2001 that Matthieu mentioned, striking such a chord with audiences and showcasing, the best of what mainstream can be.
I agree about The Favourite. I think, yeah, there's, again, two different aspects of mainstream here, is that sometimes weird film can break into mainstream via box office, though that's not the most usual thing. And sometimes they can break into the mainstream via awards. And as you mentioned, Saul, that's definitely the most common way. And The Favourite is an excellent example of that. I guess I don't know exactly how famous it is among non-cinephiles, but it's more famous than it would have been had it not won the Oscar.
When we think about the merits of mainstream cinema, one of the aspects that I touched upon briefly earlier was when discussing Christopher Nolan's films and the large budgets that he's afforded to create these films on such a grand scale. And that's an important aspect of mainstream cinema, because you get films like Gravity, which push the boundaries of the technology that is available and create these incredible sci-fi spectacles in a way that will appeal to mainstream audiences, because at the heart there's such a human story. And for me, that's one of the most important things that mainstream films have to offer, the fact that they can push the boundaries of technology because they have the support of the studios to create something to audiences haven't yet seen before.
I guess one thing that also comes to mind is we haven't discussed much the Marvel films, and yes, very much in the way they are made, they are certainly very conventional. But the fact that a film like Endgame, which is essentially a season finale of a big TV show composed of a bunch of movies, could break all these records in the box office. I mean, even though it's unadjusted, still it was a huge performance for a film that doesn't make sense if you haven't seen like at least 5 or 6 films before it. That's kind of strange. I mean, even though the film in itself is in some ways very conventional, the structure of the MCU is a very strange thing that has managed to seize on what is popular now, especially with the rise of TV shows, and make that mainstream.
Just going back to Gravity, I thought that was an interesting example that Tom brought up because obviously Alfonso Cuarón got quite a big budget to make it, and it had some very striking visuals in there. But it was still a mainstream film, and I think taking it as a sci-fi buff, looking at it, I found it a bit disappointing as a narrative because it wasn't really about the vastness and the mysteries of space, and that's sort of what I'm looking for with the sci-fi film. The Gravity was basically a thrill ride. It was very visceral. It was all about bouncing from one thing to the next, trying to survive in space. A lot like Castaway in space. I think that's the impression I had at the end of it. So I'm not surprised that it hit well with the general public, with the mainstream market. I guess what I find more impressive is something like Interstellar, because what it's taking you on with that ride is something completely different and completely unconventional, which we haven't actually seen before. But I agree with the whole idea which Tom said about big budgets being one of the main factors that make mainstream films worthwhile if a good director gets to work with a budget. One of my favorite directors is a guy called Philip Ridley, and he made a really cool film called The Reflecting Skin back in 1990. But he refuses to make a film unless it's actually got sufficient funding for it. So he's only made 2 films since then. One of them is called Heartless, which came out around 10 years ago with Jim Sturgison, and it's an excellent, thought-provoking, challenging film where nothing's quite exactly as it seems. Unless you've actually got the budget able to be able to make it, then it's really hard to up that vision forward.
That's a great example. I've seen both The Reflecting Skin and Heartless, and they are great films. But as you said, they're unconventional ideas, and perhaps they are stories that are obviously worth telling, but ones that the people who finance films aren't willing to take a risk on because they're not really bankable ideas, things that will sell. Although there's artistic merit to them and they're great films, they're never going to appeal to the masses, sadly.
Yes, unless you get a filmmaker like Tom Ford, who made A Single Man, made Nocturnal Animals, and sunk a whole lot of his own money into it. But unless you're independently wealthy like that, you can't really afford to make films like that just because you feel like making a film.
One notion of mainstream cinema that we haven't touched upon yet is the world of animation. We've obviously mentioned Marvel, but when you consider studios like Pixar as well and Toy Story, they are mainstream films that have captured a moment with children in the 90s, and then they've managed to build on that success and create sequels that are almost as good as the original. And I always think that's an impressive feat, that they can build on the nostalgia for the original, bring something new to the table, and make it appeal to multiple generations.
Yeah, with regard to animation, I think also we have to mention Disney and the ways in which it is a company that has managed to remain at the center of the mainstream for almost a century. Now with some shallow periods and some better periods, but it's kind of an impressive feat in a sense. And I agree with what Pixar has done recently is also impressive in that sense, in staying in the mainstream. And I think they have used to their advantage nostalgia, which is of course a very popular and very strong force nowadays. We see it with the various remakes of films that were very successful 20 years ago, the Jurassic Worlds and stuff like that. And I mean, we mentioned Halloween earlier, and I guess that's an element of mainstream that people criticize a lot, is how unoriginal it can be, either because it is all adaptations of stuff that was popular before, or just remakes or sequels. I guess that's also an element of mainstream cinema, is that it is building on itself.
I really like what Matthieu said about mainstream cinema building on itself. I would actually thoroughly agree with that. A lot of films coming out these days are sort of like made to expect a sequel. They're made in a way that a sequel can come out quite easily if the film was a success, which I think is what's happened a lot with the animated films. And if you just run through the box office list, the ones from Box Office Mojo, which are official lists on iCheck Movies, there's actually countless sequels there to animated films and to a lot of films that weren't really good in the first place, but they made a lot of money at the box office, and therefore a sequel came about. That's just deflecting from the animation conversation, but an interesting one would be Poor Blart Mall Cop, which is a really stupid Kevin James film. People went and saw it because it was Kevin James, made a whole lot of money. It made enough money that they managed to finance a sequel. Nobody really liked the original, and even less people liked the sequel. Everything about mainstream cinema does seem to be about building on itself, building on the familiarity, like Matthieu said, with Jurassic World and the Jurassic Park sequels, and also that nostalgia also, I guess, for the people who grew up with the original Jurassic Park. And it is definitely quite amazing what Disney's managed to do with things like Mary Poppins and have the original 1964, and now I've got the Rob Marshall version from 2018.
I think to get back to animation a bit, an interesting phenomena is the ways in which animation, because of 3D animation, has kind of democratized itself in a sense. Well, not democratized, but there are more studios making animated films than they were before the 90s, essentially. Pixar is one, though it's part of Disney, but you also have the DreamWorks and Sony and whatever. And I think you really see kind of a stratification of those movies, in that the Pixar movies, they're popular, but they're respected. The Disney movies, kind of the same. I mean, different, but these days, they're relatively well liked even by the critics. And then you have stuff like Minions and maybe like the DreamWorks movies. I don't like Madagascar, stuff like that. That is explicitly for children and nothing more. And I guess maybe that's veering off topic, but I suppose that's an aspect of the mainstream, is that when you are targeting a very specific part of the population, but that is huge because children, of course, I mean, many people have children. I mean, that's a big part of it. And yes, I guess the ways also in which Disney is reinventing itself with those live action movies, which are they live action? Like The Lion King is an interesting case, right? Is it live action or is it actually animation, just computer animation?
With the live action remakes, Disney are essentially sitting on a gold mine because everything's there ready for them to go. They've just got to remake it. And these films are famous. Adults and children love them. So the children want to go and see the new versions because it's a reimagining of a classic they once loved. And it's just a bankable hit for Disney to churn these out. I've not seen many myself, so I can't comment on the quality. But it seems sad when the mainstream is becoming inundated with remakes of films and these big studios are pumping money into them because, there's so many stories out there to be told, and it would be great if we could have more original hits.
I actually have seen them, and I think one interesting aspect of those live action remakes is that generally the more popular the original film was, like The Lion King, the less interesting the remake is, because they can't afford, or I guess they don't dare, to change anything. They just go like, we take the whole plot, even shots, and we will just do that anew. Whereas with something like The Jungle Book, which is a popular film, but it's older and maybe appeals less to nostalgia, they went with a different story. I don't think it works particularly well for that film, but at least its own thing, as opposed to something like Beauty and the Beast or The Lion King, which are almost shot-for-shot remakes of the animation originals, just in live action, quote unquote.
Quite interesting because Disney does have that whole period between, I guess, The Aristocrats and The Little Mermaid, where they had a lot of films that didn't really take off, and yet they haven't started those for live action remakes. We don't have a live action Melbourne Company. We don't have a live action Basil the Great Mouse Detective. That would be something which they could bank on, but then again, if there isn't nostalgia for that, if those aren't as well known or aren't as well liked, then perhaps there's less reason for them to want to turn those into live action films. I might also say that we probably need to at some time do a podcast about remakes, because it does come up quite often on film boards, people discussing, we're going to be remaking this film now, we're going to be remaking this classic. Yet remakes actually have existed from the very first days. Like even films like The Wizard of Oz was remake of a silent film from 1925. It would be an interesting topic to discuss at some point.
Yeah, definitely remakes are not a new phenomenon. And the lack of originality in Hollywood is also not new. I mean, I think in the 30s, there were a bunch of literary and play adaptations that were completely dominating. I mean, everything is new and nothing is new.
So we've looked into a wide range of genres and filmmaking styles when discussing the mainstream. I'd be curious to find out what my co-hosts have to think on the mainstream as a concluding point.
I guess to me, what I would say is that mainstream cinema to me is very interesting because the way in which I watch cinema, the main motivation for me is to see it as a cultural object. What does it say about the time and place it was made in. And in the case of mainstream movies, what does it say about that? That it is mainstream. I mean, art house movies are also interesting in that way because they can show more obscure parts of society, more outsider elements. But I think mainstream films have that quality that they really tell you what the values and the ideas that are going on at a time and a place. So I think we talked about Birds of Prey, and you can look at a bunch of Hollywood films of this era right now in 20 years, and you can say, oh yes, obviously feminism was a big subject. Whether or not it was done well in such and such movie is another question, but it's just interesting to look at. And I think generally that is what I find most interesting in mainstream cinema. It's what does it say about us that this is mainstream?
It's a good point that Matthieu mentions about mainstream cinema, talking about values in society and things that are commonly held up. In terms of my view on mainstream cinema, I'm not particularly fascinated with it in general, but then it's a fluctuating term, and I think it is always going to be fluctuating. So what is mainstream, what isn't mainstream will change over time. One thing which I think was mentioned in the podcast, which is a very good point, is budgets and being allowed to make different sort of films if something's popular enough to be deemed mainstream, as well as the whole idea with sequels and building on themselves. And some sequels out there are really good, but a lot of them try and copy the original or try to outdo the original rather than actually present something new. Some of them are worthwhile, some of them may be less worthwhile. I don't avoid mainstream cinema, but it's not something where I'm looking, well, the first platinum award I want to get on iCheck Movies is the box office list. It's sort of like the last platinum award that I want to get.
Like Sol, I don't avoid mainstream cinema, but it's never usually a priority for me. I think it's clear that mainstream cinema has a lot of merits, not just for being a gateway for most film fans into the world of cinema and kindling that initial passion, but for the ability to create cinema on a grand scale that perhaps wouldn't be possible without the backing of major studios. There is a lot of forgettable fare that is churned out by those studios, but every once in a while they are capable of producing cinematic gems that resonate with the masses, as well as those who are more attuned to the artistic attributes of the films that they seek out. So we hope you have enjoyed listening and would love it if you would join us for next week's episode, where we will be exploring the fascinating world of modern silent cinema and how today's filmmakers use new techniques and styles to breathe fresh life into the medium's humble origin.
You have been listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com. Hi everyone, it's Chris. I just wanted to drop in for a tiny cameo, gotta be an all of them, and to let everybody know that if you join us again next week, the films we'll be discussing will be Silent Movie, Aki Kaurismäki's Juha, The Call of Cthulhu, Brand Upon the Brain, Dr. Plonk, La Antenna, The Artist, and Blankivis. So yeah, join us again next time, and let's roll the end credits again. You have been listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com.